In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a charming stranger, Felix Langston, dazzles villagers with promises of wealth through exclusive investments. But Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, suspects he's a cunning grifter, preying on trust. As savings vanish and suspicions rise, Miss Marple sets a clever trap, unraveling Felix's web of lies in a thrilling showdown that exposes his deceit and restores justice to the village all in her signature, unassuming style. Will her ruse outsmart the shifty conman before he flees with the village's hopes? Chapter 1. The stranger in St. Mary Mead. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a warmth that seemed to soften even the sharpest edges of its quaint stone cottages. The air carried the faint scent of roses from neatly tended gardens, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly cut grass. Along the high street, the butcher's shop displayed its usual array of sausages, sentinel over the orderly rows of houses. It was a scene of such serene normalcy that any disruption, however slight, would ripple through the village like a pebble dropped in a still pond. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window of her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her advancing years, occasionally drifted from the wool to the street outside. Mrs. Price, the young widow, hurrying to the grocer's with her basket. Mr. Gibbs, the farmer, trudging along with his usual scowl, and the vicar, Leonard Clement, pausing to chat with a parishioner. It was a familiar tableau, one she had observed for decades, and yet today something felt different. The difference arrived at precisely 3:30 in the form of a sleek black motor car that purred into the village and came to a stop outside the Blue Boar Inn. Such vehicles were not entirely unknown in St. Mary Mead, but they were rare enough to draw attention. Heads turned, curtains twitched, and a few children playing near the village green paused to gape. The car door opened, and out stepped a man who seemed to belong more to the pages of a London society magazine than to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. He was tall, with an easy grace that suggested confidence, bordering on arrogance. His suit, impeccably tailored, was of a charcoal gray that spoke of expense, and his tie, a deep burgundy, was knotted with precision. His hair, dark and slightly waved, was combed back, and his smile, broad, white, and practiced, flashed as he surveyed the village. He carried a leather briefcase, its polished surface catching the sunlight, and as he strode toward the inn, he tipped his hat to Mrs. Bantry, who happened to be passing by. The news with her friends. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. She leaned slightly closer to the window, her gaze narrowing. There was something about the man, something in the way he moved, as if performing for an audience, that stirred a memory, echo of a tune she'd heard long ago. Perhaps in her youth, when she'd encountered a traveling salesman with a similar air of calculated charm. Interesting, she murmured to herself, resuming her knitting, but keeping one eye on the street. By evening, the village was abuzz with talk of the stranger. At the Blue Boar, where he had taken a room, he introduced himself as Mr. Felix Langston, a retired investor from London seeking the tranquility of rural life. Over pints of ale, he regaled the locals with tales of his travels: Paris, New York, even a brief stint in Shanghai. His stories were vivid, filled with just enough detail to dazzle, but not enough to invite scrutiny. He spoke of fortunes made, in stocks and bonds, of grand hotels and glittering parties. And he did so with a warmth that made even the most skeptical villager lean closer. Mrs. Bantry. She bustled into the drawing-room, her cheeks pink with excitement, and settled into a chair with a rustle of her floral dress. "Jane, have you heard about this Mr. Langston? He's taken a room at the Blue Boar, and they say he's worth a fortune. He's talking of investing in the village, perhaps a new community hall or even a little library." But her eyes keen. "Indeed, Dolly. He sounds most generous. What do we know of him, though? A man of means, you say? But from where?" "Oh, London, I believe," Mrs. Bantry replied, waving a hand airily. "He mentioned something about stocks and shares. Very complicated, I'm sure. But he's so polite, Jane, and so well dressed. He tipped his hat to me yesterday, and I declare I felt quite like a girl again." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Politeness is a lovely quality," she said, "but it can cover a multitude of sins, don't you think? I recall a young man who came to stay with my aunt years ago. Charming, always bowing and smiling, but it turned out he was selling worthless shares to half the county." Mrs. Bantry laughed, though there was a hint of unease in it. "Oh, Jane, you do see the worst in people. I'm sure Mr. Langston is perfectly respectable. Why, he's already promised to donate to the Church Restoration Fund. Has he, now?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her mind was already turning. Generosity, especially when announced so publicly, often had a motive. She thought of the salesman again, the one who'd charmed her aunt's friends with promises of riches, only to vanish with their savings. "Well," she added, "I look forward to meeting this Mr. Langston. I'm sure he'll be most enlightening." Over the next few days, Felix Langston became a fixture in St. Mary Mead. He was seen everywhere, chatting with the butcher about prime cuts, discussing roses with Miss Hartnell, and even joining the vicar for tea at the vicarage. His presence seemed to invigorate the village, as if his arrival had brought a touch of cosmopolitan glamour to their quiet lives. He spoke often of his plans to settle in the area, hinting at grand projects that would put St. Mary Mead on the map, a new cricket pavilion, perhaps, or a fund to support local artisans. The villagers, flattered by his interest, began to dream of a brighter, more prosperous future. Miss Marple, however, remained watchful. From her window, she noted the way Felix lingered after conversations, his eyes scanning the crowd as if assessing who was most impressionable. She saw him pause outside the post office, studying the notice board where local events were pinned, and she wondered what he was looking for. When he attended church on Sunday, sitting in a pew near the front and singing hymns with gusto, she observed how his gaze flickered to the collection plate, as if calculating its contents. Her suspicions grew when she learned, through the ever-alive village gossip network, that Felix had begun offering private consultations. He invited select villagers to the Blue Boar, where, over tea or sherry, he outlined an exclusive investment opportunity. It was a scheme, he said, that promised remarkable returns, far better than the banks could offer. All it required was a modest initial sum, and in a year or two, the investors would see their money double, perhaps triple. The details were vague, something about a consortium in London and a new railway venture. But his confidence was infectious. Mrs. Emily Price, the young widow who lived in a modest cottage near the church, was among the first to take an interest. Miss Marple heard of it from Cherry, her maid, who had a knack for picking up tidbits from the village. "Mrs. Price was at the Blue Boar last night," Cherry said, as she dusted the mantelpiece. "She was all smiles, talking about how Mr. Langston's going to make her rich. She's put in nearly all her savings, Miss Marple says. It's for her little boy's future." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Her savings, you say? That's a great deal of trust to place in a man we've only just met." Cherry nodded, her duster pausing. "That's what I thought, Miss. But he's got a way about him that Mr. Langston makes you feel like you're the only one in the room when he talks. Mrs. Price said he showed her papers, all official looking, with stamps and seals." "Papers can be forged," Miss Marple said softly, her needles moving faster, "and seals can be bought. I remember a case in Little Hampton years ago where a man produced the most convincing documents. Turned out they were drawn up by a printer in Bristol who'd never left his shop." Cherry's eyes widened. "Do you think Mr. Langston's up to no good, miss?" "I don't think anything yet," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm but her mind racing. "But I do believe in being cautious. Tell me, Cherry, who else has been to see Mr. Langston?" As Cherry rattled off names, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Hartnell, even old Mr. Pye, who was notoriously tight with his money, Miss Marple's unease deepened. She knew the village well, knew its people and their weaknesses. Mrs. Bantry was impulsive, eager for excitement. Miss Hartnell was proud, easily flattered by attention. And Mr. Pye, despite his frugality, had a secret fondness for gambling. They were perfect targets for a man like Felix Langston, if indeed he was what she suspected. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll. She put on her best hatta, sensible straw, one with a small ribbon, and walked to the High Street. Her steps slow but purposeful. She stopped at the post office to buy stamps, lingering to chat with Mrs. Blade, the postmistress, who was always a font of information. "Double quotes, Mr. Langston's been in twice this week," Mrs. Blade said, leaning over the counter. "Posted a whole stack of letters to London, he did. Thick envelopes, too, like they were full of papers. Said it was business, but he didn't say what kind. Did he, now?" Miss Marple said, her tone light. "And did he receive any post?" "Not much," Mrs. Blade admitted. "Just a few letters. One from a bank in London. Looked important. Mind you, fancy crest on the envelope." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind turning over the details. Letters to London, a bank crest, thick envelopes, Sit all suggested. Activity, but of what kind? She thought of the salesman again, the one who'd swindled her aunt's friends. He, too, had been fond of posting letters, always with a flourish to make them seem important. By the time anyone realized the truth, he was long gone, and so was the money. Her walk took her past the Blue Boar, where she saw Felix Langston himself, standing on the steps and talking animatedly to Mr. Gibbs. The farmer's face was red, his gestures sharp, and Miss Marple slowed her pace, pretending to adjust her shawl. She couldn't hear the words, but the tension was clear. Gibbs shook his head, turned on his heel, and stalked off toward his farm. Felix watched him go, his smile fading for a moment before he caught sight of Miss Marple and raised his hand in greeting. "Good afternoon, madam," he called, his voice warm and polished. "A fine day for a walk, isn't it?" "Very fine, Mr. Langston," Miss Marple replied, her smile as gentle as ever. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Jane Marple, just up the lane. His eyes lit up, and he descended the steps to meet her, his handshake firm but not overbearing. "A pleasure, Miss Marple. I've heard you're something of a fixture in St. Mary Mead. I hope to become half as respected as you seem to be." "I'm just an old woman who likes her garden and her knitting," she said, her tone self-deprecating, but her eyes never leaving his face. "You, however, seem to be making quite a stir. All this talk of investments and projects, it's most exciting for our little village." He laughed, a rich, easy sound. "I hope to contribute, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead has such potential. A few wise investments, a touch of modernization, and who knows what it could become." "Indeed," she said, nodding. "Though one must always be careful with investments, mustn't one? So many promises turn out to be less than they seem." For a fraction of a second his smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Quite right, quite right. That's why I only deal with reputable firms. Perhaps you'd like to hear more. I'm holding a little meeting tomorrow evening at the Blue Boar, just a few friends discussing opportunities." "How kind," Miss Marple said. "I'll consider it. My nephew Raymond often advises me on such matters. He's a writer, you know, but he has a good head for figures." Felix's expression didn't change, but she thought she saw a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "A writer. Fascinating. I'd love to meet him. Do bring him along, Miss Marple." Parted with pleasantries, and Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind buzzing. Felix Langston was charming, no doubt, but charm was a tool, and tools could be wielded for good or ill. She thought of Mrs. Price's savings, of Miss Hartnell's pride, of Mr. Pye's hidden greed. She thought of the salesman from her youth, whose smile had been just as bright, just as practiced, back at home. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from the pale blue shawl. She recalled a conversation with her friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once told her about a swindler who operated under multiple names, always targeting small communities where trust was high and skepticism low. The man had been caught, eventually, but not before ruining countless lives. Was Felix Langston such a man? She couldn't be sure not yet, but she would watch, and she would listen, and she would knit, and in time the truth would reveal itself, as it always did. The days that followed were filled with more talk of Felix Langston. He attended the Women's Institute meeting, where he charmed the ladies with a donation to their charity drive. He played a round of cards at the village hall, letting Mr. Pye win just enough to keep him interested. He even visited the school, promising to fund new books for the children. Everywhere he went, he left a trail of goodwill, and yet Miss Marple's unease grew. One evening, as she sat with her tea, Cherry burst into the room, her face flushed. "Miss Marple, you won't believe it. Mrs. Bantry's gone and invested with Mr. Langston. £500, she said. She's convinced she'll be rich by Christmas." Miss Marple's needles stopped. £500, she repeated softly. "That's a great deal of money, Cherry." "Did she say what the investment was for?" "Something about a railway in the north," Cherry said. "She showed me a paper he gave her, all full of numbers and charts. Looked ever so official." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene, but her mind racing. Railways, consortiums, official papers, it was all too familiar. She thought of the salesman again, and of another case. One she'd read about in the Times, where a charming man had vanished with thousands, leaving behind nothing but forged documents and broken dreams. "Cherry," she said, "would you mind popping round to the vicarage tomorrow? I'd like to have a word with Mr. Clement. And perhaps," she added, almost to herself, "it's time I wrote to my nephew. Raymond always has such interesting friends in London." As Cherry nodded and left to make supper, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The village of St. Mary Mead was her world, and she knew its rhythms, its people, its secrets. Felix Langston might be a stranger, but he was not invisible, not to her. And if he was indeed a shifty grifter, as she suspected, then she would find a way to unmask him. It would take patience, observation, and perhaps a clever ruse of her own. But Miss Marple was no stranger to such things. The game, as her friend Sir Henry might say, was afoot. Chapter 2. Whispers of wealth. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting golden rays across the tidy cottages and neatly trimmed hedges that lined the village's main street. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, and the hum of lazy bees mingled with the distant chatter of villagers going about their daily routines. It was a scene of such tranquil ordinariness that one might have thought nothing could disturb the peaceful rhythm of this small corner of England. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle shift was occurring, one that Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, had already begun to notice. In the week following Mr. Felix Langston's arrival, himself with the villagers, his polished manners, easy smile, and apparent wealth had made him the subject of much discussion at the village shop, the post office, and the tea rooms. He had taken up residence in a charming rented cottage at the edge of the village, a quaint stone building with ivy climbing its walls and a small garden bursting with late-season flowers. The cottage, once occupied by a reclusive artist, had been empty for months, and Felix's arrival seemed to breathe new life into it. He was often seen strolling through the village, tipping his hat to passers-by, or stopping to admire a garden or exchange pleasantries with a shopkeeper. And his accent, a smooth blend of London polish with a hint of something vaguely continental, only added to his mystique. It was at the village hall, during a meeting of the Women's Institute, that Felix first introduced his investment opportunities. The hall was a modest space, its walls adorned with faded photographs of past village events and a slightly crooked notice board, listing upcoming bake sales and gardening competitions. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender from the sachets Mrs. Bantry had placed on the window-sills. The meeting had been called to discuss the annual flower show, but Felix, who had been invited as a courtesy to the newcomer, seized the opportunity to address the gathered women. "Ladies," he began, standing at the front of the room with the confidence of a seasoned orator, "I must say how charmed I am by the warmth of St. Mary Mead. It's a rare thing to find a community so vibrant, so full of life. I've traveled far and wide, London, Paris, even New York, and yet I find myself utterly captivated by this village." His voice was warm, almost musical, and the women in the audience leaned forward, their eyes bright with curiosity. Mrs. Bantry, seated in the front row with her usual air of cheerful enthusiasm, beamed at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Felix paused, letting his words settle, then continued. "As some of you may know, I've had the good fortune to build a modest fortune through careful investments. where I find it. I've recently come across a venture, a small but promising enterprise in London that's yielding remarkable returns. It's not for everyone. Mind you, it requires a certain boldness, a willingness to seize the moment. But for those who are interested, I'd be delighted to offer a chance to join me in this endeavor. The room buzzed with murmurs. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, and she turned to her neighbor, Mrs. Price, a young widow who had recently inherited a modest sum from her late husband's estate. "Isn't that exciting?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "A real businessman, right here in St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Price, whose delicate features were framed by a simple black bonnet, nodded hesitantly. She was a quiet woman, still grieving her loss, and her pale hands fidgeted with the hem of her shawl. "It does sound intriguing," she murmured, though her tone betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Miss Marple, seated near the back of the room, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, the pale blue wool forming neat rows as her sharp eyes took in every detail. She noted the way Felix's smile lingered just a fraction too long, the way his gaze swept the room as if calculating the wealth of each listener. There was something about his manner, practiced ease, a touch to polish that reminded her of a traveling salesman. The man had been charming, too, with a silver tongue and a knack for making promises that sounded too good to be true. And, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, they usually were. Over the next few days, Felix's investment opportunities became the talk of the village. He was careful not to push too hard, instead dropping hints in casual conversation at the butcher's counter, during a chance meeting at the post office, or while admiring the vicar's roses. He spoke of a select group of investors, a limited opportunity that required quick action. The exclusivity of it all only heightened the villagers' interest. Learn more. Mrs. Bantry was among the first to take the plunge. She was a woman of boundless optimism, with a tendency to see the best in everyone. "Hall," she confided in Miss Marple about her decision. The two women sat in the drawing-room, a cozy space filled with chintz, cushions, and the faint scent of lavender polish. Mrs. Bantry's spaniel, Rusty, lay sprawled by the hearth, snoring softly. "I've put in £1,000, Mrs. Bantry announced, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she poured tea from a chipped but cherished teapot. "It's not a fortune, of course, but Mr. Langston says it could double within a year. Imagine that, Jane, doubling one's money. Arthur thinks I'm being a bit reckless, but then he's always so cautious. What do you think?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild but her mind racing. "It does sound ambitious," she said carefully, setting her cup down. "And what exactly is this investment, Dolly? Did Mr. Langston explain it to you?" "Oh, it's something to do with property development in London," Mrs. Bantry said, waving a hand airily. "New buildings, modern flats, that sort of thing. He says it's all very safe, backed by a reputable firm. He showed me some papers, very official looking, with lots of numbers and signatures." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. "Papers," she repeated, her tone neutral. "Did you read them thoroughly?" Mrs. Bantry laughed, a bright, carefree sound. "Oh, Jane, you know I'm no good with all that legal nonsense. But Mr. Langston explained it so clearly. He's such a gentleman, don't you think? So refined. He even offered to handle all the paperwork for me." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her mind was elsewhere. She had seen men like Felix before, men who spoke with confidence and waved official-looking documents, men who preyed on trust and optimism. She thought of Mrs. Bantry's £1,000, a significant sum for a woman whose husband extravagantly wealthy. She thought, too, of Mrs. Price, whose inheritance was all she had to secure her future. As she sat in her small, neat sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on Felix's behavior. She had overheard him at the village shop speaking to Mr. Pock, the butcher, about his London connections. His answers had been vague, almost evasive, when Mr. Pock asked about his background. "Oh, I've been here and there," Felix had said with a laugh, deftly steering the conversation to the quality of the local sausages. Miss Marple had also noticed his habit of paying for small purchases with large, crisp banknotes, a curious choice for a village where most transactions were conducted with coins or modest bills. It was a small detail, but to Miss Marple, small details were often the key to unraveling larger truths. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to take a walk to the village shop, ostensibly to buy a skein of wool, but really to observe Felix's interactions. The shop, run by the cheerful but gossipy Mrs. Weatherby, was a hub of village news, and Miss Marple knew she could count on hearing the latest about Felix's activities. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Weatherby looked up from her counter, where she was sorting a pile of letters. "Good morning, Miss Marple. He was in here yesterday, talking to young Tommy Black about investing in some sort of shipping venture. Said it's the next big think cargo ships or some such." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Shipping, you say? How interesting. And did Mr. Langston mention any details?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Not much, but he made it sound awfully grand. Said it's all tied to trade routes in the East, spices, silks, that sort of thing. Tommy was quite taken with it. Mind you, I told him to be careful. My cousin in Bristol lost a packet on a shipping scheme years ago. All promises and no profit, it was." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers brushing the soft wool of a skein on the counter. "Wise advice, Mrs. Weatherby. It's always best to know exactly where one's money is going." The days that followed were busy ones for Miss Marple. She wrote a letter to Raymond, carefully phrasing her request for information about investment scams in London. She visited the village shop again, chatting with Mrs. Weatherby about Felix's purchases and listening for any new gossip. She even called on Mrs. Price, under the pretense of borrowing a recipe, and gently probed for details about her investment. Mrs. Price was reluctant to speak at first, but her worries soon spilled out. Felix had promised her returns by the end of the month, but when she asked for an update, he had been evasive, saying the funds were tied up in escrow. "Escrow," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "How interesting. And did he explain what that meant?" Mrs. Price shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Not really. He just said it's all very complicated and that I shouldn't worry. But I can't help it, Miss Marple. It's all I have left from my George." Miss Marple patted her hand gently, her heart aching for the young woman. "There, there, my dear," she said. "I'm sure it will all come right, but it might be wise to ask for a written statement of your investment, just to be safe." Mrs. Price nodded, though her expression was doubtful. Miss Marple left the cottage with a renewed sense of purpose. She was more convinced than ever that Felix Langston was not what he seemed. His promises were too grand, his answers too vague, his charm too calculated. But she needed more than suspicions. She needed proof that would protect her friends and neighbors from losing everything to a man who might vanish as quickly as he had appeared. As she walked home, the village seemed quieter than usual. The streets bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Miss Marple's steps were slow but steady, her mind sharp and focused. She thought of the old adage about fools and their money, and she resolved that no one in St. Mary Mead would be made a fool not if she could help it. Felix Langston might think himself clever, but Miss Marple had unraveled clever schemes before, and she would do so again. All it would take was patience, observation, and a touch of her own quiet cunning. Chapter 3. The vicar's doubts. The morning sun filtered through the stained-glass windows of St. Mary Mead's modest church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the worn pews. The Reverend Leonard Clement stood at the pulpit, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed his sermon notes for the upcoming Sunday service, his brow furrowed, not from the complexities of Scripture, but from a nagging unease that had settled in his chest since the arrival of Mr. Felix Langston. The charming newcomer had swept into the village like a warm breeze, but to Leonard there was something faintly artificial about the man's polished demeanor, like a painting too perfect to be true. Leonard's study, tucked behind the vestry, was a sanctuary of books and quiet reflection. The shelves sagged under the weight of theological tomes, local histories, and a few well-loved novels, their spines cracked from years of use. A small window overlooked the churchyard where flitted among the gravestones. It was here, amidst the scent of old paper and beeswax, that Leonard often found clarity. But this morning, clarity eluded him. He sat at his desk, a cup of tea growing cold, and stared at the ledger where he recorded donations to the church's restoration fund. Mr. Langston's name appeared in bold ink, a generous £50, far more than the usual shillings and pence from parishioners. It was a sum that should have brought gratitude, yet it stirred suspicion. The vicar's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called, his voice gentle but distracted. Stepped inside, her black lace mittens clutching a small basket of apples from her garden. Her eyes, sharp and bright as ever, scanned the room before settling on Leonard with a warm smile. "Good morning, Leonard," she said, her tone as light as the morning breeze. "I thought you might appreciate a few apples for the vicarage. The tree by the fence has been quite prolific this year." Leonard rose, managing a smile despite his preoccupation. "Miss Marple, how kind of you. Please, have a seat. I was just, wrestling with a few thoughts." He gestured to a chair opposite his desk, her posture prim but relaxed, as if she were merely there to discuss the weather. "Wrestling, you say? That sounds rather serious for a Tuesday morning." Miss Marple had a way of seeing through people, as if their thoughts were written in plain text. He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But something about him doesn't sit right. I can't put my finger on it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Oh, and what makes you say that, Leonard?" The vicar leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "It's the little things. He's charming, certainly, and the villagers adore him. But when I asked about his background, nothing intrusive, just polite conversation. He was vague. Said he'd been in finance in London, but no specifics. Mention of a firm or colleagues, or even where he lived. And when I asked for some documentation about his investment scheme, the one he's been talking up to half the village, he promised to bring it later, but it's been weeks, and I've seen nothing. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her basket. I see. And you're worried he might not be what he seems. Leonard's shoulders slumped. I hate to think ill of anyone, especially someone who's done no obvious wrong, but I've a responsibility to the parish. People are investing their savings with him, Mrs. Bantry, for one, and now I hear Mrs. Price is considering it her entire inheritance. Miss Marple, if something's amiss, I'd never forgive myself for staying silent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where a sparrow perched on a gravestone, its head cocked as if listening. Mrs. Price, she murmured. Yes, I heard she was quite taken with Mr. Langston at the Women's Institute meeting. He has a way of making people feel special, doesn't he? Leonard nodded grimly. He does. Too much so, perhaps. I've seen men like him before, charming, quick with a smile, but slippery when you try to pin them down. I don't want to judge unfairly, but I can't shake the feeling he's leading people into something risky. Miss Marple set her basket on the floor and folded her hands in her lap. You're quite right to be cautious, Leonard. It's not unchristian to question, especially when others' livelihoods are at stake. Have you spoken to anyone else about this? Not yet, he admitted. I didn't want to stir gossip without cause, but I knew you'd understand. You always seem to notice things others miss. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes remained sharp. Oh, I'm just an old woman who pays attention to the world around her. People are like skeins of wool. Sometimes you have to unravel a bit to see the pattern. She paused, then added, Tell me, what do you know of Mrs. Price's involvement with Mr. Langston? Leonard frowned, recalling a conversation from the previous evening. She came to me after evensong, all flushed and excited, said Mr. Langston. Had promised her a return of 10% on her investment within 6 months. 10%. It sounds too good to be true, and I told her so, gently. But she's young, widowed, and, well, vulnerable. She trusts him, said he reminded her of her late husband. God rest his soul. Grief can cloud judgment. And Mr. Langston seems adept at exploiting trust. Did she mention how much she's investing? Her entire inheritance? £2,000, I believe. It's all she has from her husband's estate. Leonard trailed off, his face etched with worry. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of the chair, a habit that betrayed her racing thoughts. Though I don't know the amount. She's been singing Langston's praises at every turn, says he's going to make her a fortune. But Dolly Bantry's always been a bit impulsive. Years ago a traveling salesman who'd come to St. Mary Mead with promises of miracle tonics. He'd charmed the village, too, until a few sharp questions from a skeptical grocer revealed his bottles contained little more than colored water. Mr. Langston, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, though his scheme was far grander. Leonard, she said at last, I think it might be wise to keep a close eye on Mr. Langston. Discreetly, of course. We wouldn't want to accuse an innocent man. But perhaps I could have a word with Mrs. Price, offer her some neighborly advice, and Mrs. Bantry, too. It's only prudent to ensure they understand the risks. The vicar's face brightened, relief evident in his eyes. would you? I'd be so grateful, Miss Marple. You have a way of putting people at ease, making them see sense without feeling foolish. Miss Marple waved a hand dismissively. Oh, I'm no one special, just an old spinster with too much time on her hands. But I'll do what I can. In the meantime, perhaps you could ask Mr. Langston again for those documents, politely, of course. It might be illuminating. Leonard nodded, a spark of determination replacing his earlier unease. I will, and I'll let you know if he says anything odd. Thank you, Miss Marple. I feel better just having spoken to you. As Miss Marple rose to leave, her basket of apples in hand, she paused at the door. Have you noticed Mr. Langston spending much time with anyone in particular? Someone who might know more about his business? The vicar thought for a moment. Not especially, though he's been very attentive to Miss Hartnell lately. He was at her cottage for tea last week, and I saw them walking together near the High Street yesterday. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind cataloguing this new detail. From your sermon. Good day, Leonard. Good day, Miss Marple, he replied, watching as she stepped out into the churchyard. Her figure small but resolute against the backdrop of ancient use. The village of St. Mary Mead bustled with its usual quiet rhythm as Miss Marple made her way home. The High Street was alive with the soft clatter of bicycle wheels and the chatter of women outside the grocer's shop. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, waved cheerfully, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Leonard's concerns had confirmed her own suspicions, and the mention of Mrs. Emily Price's inheritance added urgency to her quiet investigation. Their promises, like spiderwebs, to ensnare the unwary. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set her basket on the kitchen table and began peeling apples for a pie, her hands moving with the practiced ease of years. The repetitive task freed her mind to wander, and she turned over the pieces of the puzzle. Felix's vagueness, his generous donations, his focus on wealthy villagers like Miss Hartnell, it all pointed to a calculated plan. She recalled a story in the Daily Clarion some months back about a confidence trickster who'd fleeced a small town in Kent with a similar investment scheme. The details were hazy, but the pattern felt familiar. Chapter 4. A pattern emerges. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor of her sitting room in St. Mary Mead. Her eyes, however, were not on her knitting, but on the quiet street outside, where the postman was making his rounds and Mrs. Pauk from the butcher's shop was sweeping her doorstep. The village seemed as serene as ever, but Miss Marple's mind was far from tranquil. She was piecing together a puzzle, one that had begun with the arrival of Mr. Felix Langston and was growing more intricate by the day. Her thoughts drifted back to the previous evening when she had taken tea with Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry, ever enthusiastic, had been full of talk about Felix's latest investment scheme. He says it's a chance to double one's money in just 6 months, she had exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. He's got connections in London. You know big firms, important people. He showed me a letter from one of them, all very official looking. Miss Marple had smiled politely, murmuring something non-committal, but her mind had been elsewhere. The letter, she suspected, was likely a forgery, or, at the very least, exaggerated. She had seen such tactics before, in her youth, when a traveling Salesmen had swindled her uncle's parish with promises of miraculous crop yields from a dubious fertilizer. Now, as she knitted, Miss Marple considered the broader picture. Felix's charm was undeniable. He had a way of making everyone feel special, as if they were privy to a secret only he could unlock. But charm, she knew, was often a grifter's greatest weapon. She recalled a case from years ago, reported in the Daily Chronicle, about a man who had posed as a financier in a small market town, collecting investments for a non-existent railway project. The parallels were striking: vague references to grand connections, promises of quick wealth, and a carefully cultivated air of trustworthiness. Felix, she suspected, was cut from the same cloth. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Cherry, her young maid, with a tray of tea and biscuits. "Morning, Miss Marple," Cherry said cheerfully, setting the tray on the small table beside her. "You're up early today, thinking about something, I'll bet." Miss Marple smiled. Cherry was sharp, with a knack for noticing things others missed, a quality Miss Marple appreciated. "Just wool gathering, my dear," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Tell me, Cherry, have you heard anything new about our Mr. Langston?" Cherry's eyes lit up. She loved a bit of village gossip, and Miss Marple knew how to draw it out without seeming too eager. "Oh, plenty," Cherry said, pouring tea. "They're all talking about him at the Blue Boar. Mr. Hoskins, from the post office, says he saw Felix posting a stack of letters yesterday, all addressed to London. And Mrs. Wicks at the shop says he's been buying things with big notes, fivers, mostly crisp as you please. She thought it was odd, him having so much cash when he's supposed to be investing everyone's money." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. Crisp banknotes were not common in St. Mary Mead, where most transactions were modest and often settled with coins or small bills. "Interesting," she murmured. "And what do the younger folk say about him?" Cherry grinned. "The girls at the hairdresser's think he's ever so handsome. Sally Turner says he's got a smile like a film star. But Tommy Piercy's the butcher's boy. He reckons Felix is a bit too smooth, like he's always selling something, even when he's just chatting." "Tommy's a perceptive lad," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. She made a mental note to speak with Tommy herself. Young people, she found, often saw through facades that older, more trusting villagers missed. "Thank you, Cherry. If you hear anything else, do let me know." As Cherry bustled off to the kitchen, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook. It was a small, leather-bound volume she kept for jotting down observations, a habit she had picked up years ago when helping her nephew, Raymond, unravel a particularly tricky case. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write Felix Langston observations. Frequent trips to London, purpose unclear. Possible meetings with an accomplice. Pays with large, crisp banknote, source of funds unknown. Cash reserves suggest he's not investing as claimed. Vague about past. Avoids detailed questions. Likely hiding a criminal history or false identity. Parallels to 1927 railway scam. Daily Chronicle, June 14th. Charismatic leader, promises of wealth, forged documents. She paused, tapping her pencil against the page. The railway scam had ended with the swindler vanishing, leaving investors penniless. She was determined that St. Mary Mead would not suffer a similar fate. But to stop Felix, she needed more than suspicions. She needed evidence. and that meant stepping beyond the confines of her cozy sitting room. Later that morning, Miss Marple put on her best hat, a sensible black one with a small feather, and set out for the village. Her destination was the shop owned by Mrs. Wicks, a bustling establishment that served as both grocer and informal hub of village news. If anyone had noticed something unusual about Felix, it would be Mrs. Wicks, whose sharp eyes missed little. The shop was busy when Miss Marple arrived, with several villagers queuing for bread and tinned goods. Mrs. Wicks, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, was behind the counter, weighing out sugar from Mrs. Bantry's cook. Miss Marple waited patiently, exchanging pleasantries with those around her. She had learned long ago that patience often yielded more than haste. When the queue thinned, she approached the counter. "Good morning, Mrs. Wicks," she said warmly. "I was hoping you might have some of those nice digestive biscuits. They're so good with tea." Mrs. Wicks beamed. "Got a fresh batch in yesterday, Miss Marple. I'll fetch you a packet." As she reached under the counter, Miss Marple leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I hear our new friend Mr. Langston has been quite the customer lately. Such a generous man, always spending, isn't he?" Mrs. Wicks's eyes narrowed, sensing a chance to share a tidbit. "Oh, he's generous, all right. Comes in here buying cigars and fancy tinned salmon, always paying with big notes. I had to send my boy to the bank in Much Benham to get change last week. Makes you wonder where it all comes from, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "I suppose he must have a great deal of cash on hand, with all these investments he's managing." Mrs. Wicks snorted. "Managing, that's what he calls it. My cousin in Chipping Cleghorn lost half her savings to a man like that years ago. Talker, promised her the moon, never saw a penny back. I told her, I said, 'Edith, you've got to check their credentials proper.' But does anyone listen?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's so easy to be taken in by a charming manner. Did Mr. Langston mention anything about his business when he was here?" "Not much," Mrs. Wicks admitted. "Said something about a deal in London. But when I asked for details, he just smiled and changed the subject. Slippery, that one." She handed Miss Marple the biscuits, adding, "You be careful, Miss Marple. I know you're sensible, but he's got half the village eating out of his hand." "Thank you, Mrs. Wicks," Miss Marple said, tucking the biscuits into her basket. "I'll keep that in mind." As she left the shop, Miss Marple's mind was racing. The crisp banknotes, the vague references to London, the reluctance to share details, it all pointed to a carefully constructed facade. But what was Felix's endgame? Was he planning to vanish with the villagers' money, as the railway swindler had done? Or was there something larger at play, perhaps involving property, like Mr. Gibbs's land? Her next stop was the post office, where Mr. Hoskins, a wiry man with a penchant for gossip, was sorting letters. Miss Marple bought a few stamps, then casually mentioned Felix's recent activities. "I hear he's been sending a great many letters to London," she said. "He must be a very busy man." Mr. Hoskins glanced up, eager to share. "Busy, you say? He's in here near every day, posting parcels and letters. All to London, mind you, same address, from what I can tell. I don't read the mail, of course," he added quickly, "but you can't help noticing when it's always the same envelope." "How curious," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright with interest. "And does he receive much mail in return?" "Not much," Mr. Hoskins said, scratching his chin. A few letters now and then, but nothing like what he sends out. Makes you wonder what he's up to, doesn't it? It does, indeed, Miss Marple agreed. She thanked him and stepped back into the street, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Frequent letters to a single address suggested Felix was communicating with someone specific, perhaps an accomplice or a contact handling the funds he collected. She would need to find out more about that address, but that would require help from someone with access to broader resources. That afternoon, Miss Marple took the train to London to visit her nephew, Raymond West. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, lived in a smart flat in Bloomsbury, where he entertained a circle of literary friends. He was fond of his aunt, though he sometimes teased her about her village instincts. Today, however, he was all ears when she explained her concerns about Felix. Chapter 5. The Garden Party. The sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green, where preparations for Felix Langston's garden party were in full swing. The event had been the talk of the village for days, with Felix's invitations printed on creamy cardstock, with embossed gold lettering at nearly every doorstep. The grandeur of it all was unusual for their quiet hamlet, and the villagers buzzed with anticipation, their curiosity piqued by the newcomer's apparent wealth and charm. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with a cup of tea, watched the flurry of activity from her cottage, her sharp eyes noting every detail. The green had been transformed. A large white marquee stood at the center, its flaps fluttering in the gentle breeze. Long tables draped in crisp linen were laden with platters of sandwiches, scones, and delicate pastries, while a string quartet tuned their instruments under a canopy of roses. Felix had spared no expense, and the villagers, from the postmistress to the butcher, were agog with excitement. Children darted about, chasing each other through the grass, while their parents, dressed in their Sunday best, whispered about the mysterious Mr. Langston and his promises of prosperity. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and sipped her tea, her mind turning over the puzzle that was Felix Langston. She had accepted his invitation, of course, not out of eagerness for cucumber sandwiches or champagne, but because such an event would offer a rare opportunity to observe the man in his element. There was something about Felix that didn't quite fit, like a piece of embroidery stitched with the wrong thread. His polished manners, his too perfect smile, his vague allusions to a past filled with grand ventures, they all stirred a faint memory of a charlatan she'd encountered years ago. A man who'd swindled half a parish before vanishing into the night. Felix, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, and the garden party would be his stage. She arrived at the green promptly at 3, her straw hat tilted just so, her walking stick tapping lightly on the path. The air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, and the hum of conversation greeted her as she approached the marquee. Mrs. Bantry, in a floral dress that clashed magnificently with her hat, waved her over with enthusiasm. "Isn't this splendid?" she called, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mr. Langston has outdone himself. Why, it's like something out of a London gala." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's certainly lavish," she agreed, her eyes scanning the crowd. Felix stood near the center of the marquee, in a cream suit, shaking hands and laughing heartily with Mr. Weatherby, the local solicitor. His charm was undeniable, his gestures expansive, and the villagers hung on his every word. Miss Marple noted the way he moved from group to group, his attention lingering longest on those with deeper pockets. Miss Hartnell, the spinster who owned the largest house in the village, and Dr. Haydock, whose medical practice had left him comfortably well off. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing waiter and settled onto a wicker chair, her knitting bag at her side. From this vantage point, she could observe without drawing attention, her presence as unremarkable as the wallpaper in her own sitting room. Mrs. Bantry plopped down beside her, fanning herself with a program. "He's promised to make a speech later," she said, nodding toward Felix. "Something about his next venture. I do hope it's as exciting as he says. Arthur's been talking about investing, you know." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Has he, now?" she murmured, her tone neutral but her mind alert. Mrs. Bantry's husband, Colonel Bantry, was a kind man but not a discerning one, and his wife's enthusiasm for Felix's schemes was troubling. "What does Arthur say about it?" "Oh, you know Arthur," Mrs. Bantry said with a laugh. "He thinks it's all terribly modern stocks and bonds and such. Mr. Langston says we could double our money in a year. Imagine that, Jane. We could finally fix the roof at Gossington Hall." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, though her expression remained pleasant. "It sounds very promising," she said carefully, "though I do wonder about the details. Investments can be so complicated." Mrs. Bantry waved a hand. "Oh, I leave all that to Arthur. Mr. Langston says it's all quite straightforward. Something about a shipping company in Bristol. Or was it Liverpool? Well, somewhere important." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes still on Felix. He was now deep in conversation with Miss Hartnell, who was blushing under his attention. The woman's fortune, inherited from a distant uncle, was no secret in St. Mary Mead, and Felix's interest in her was telling. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched him lean closer, his smile dazzling. Miss Hartnell, a stern woman, not easily swayed, seemed almost girlish, her laughter carrying across the green. A grifter, Miss Marple thought, knows his marks well. The string quartet struck up a lively tune, and couples began to dance on a wooden platform laid out near the marquee. The children had abandoned their games to swarm the desert table, and the air was filled with laughter and clinking glasses. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the edge of the crowd, where young Tommy Cole, the baker's son, was watching Felix with a frown. Tommy, a bright lad with ambitions beyond the village, had been helping Felix with odd jobs at his cottage. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him later. Boys like Tommy often saw things others missed. As the afternoon wore on, Felix climbed onto a small dais, tapping a spoon against his glass to draw attention. The music faded, and the villagers turned toward him, their faces expectant. He stood tall, his dark hair gleaming in the sunlight, his smile as warm as the summer day. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly, "I cannot tell you how much it means to be welcomed so warmly to St. Mary Mead. When I arrived, I sought a place of peace, but I've found so much Mara community of kind, spirited people who've made me feel at home." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Flattery, she knew, was a conman's sharpest tool. "I've spoken to many of you about my work," Felix continued, "and I'm thrilled to share that my latest venture is moving forward at pace. A shipping enterprise, one that promises to bring wealth not only to me, but to all who join me. I've secured a partnership with a fine gentleman in London, a man with connections in the highest circles. Together, we'll build something extraordinary. Miss Grown-ups gasped, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A business partner in London, he'd said. The words echoed in her mind, unbidden, stirring a memory of a newspaper article about a pair of swindlers who'd worked the city's elite. One charming the investors, while the other handled the money. She couldn't recall the details, but the pattern felt familiar. Felix raised his glass to new beginnings and shared prosperity. The crowd cheered, and he drank deeply, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Miss Marple wondered if he felt her scrutiny, for his gaze lingered on her for a moment before moving on. She smiled blandly, her needles never pausing, as the speech ended and the music resumed. Mrs. Price approached, her face pale despite the warm day. Miss Marple, have you seen Emily? She asked, her voice low. Not recently, Miss Marple replied, noting the widow's distress. Is something wrong, my dear? Mrs. Price hesitated, glancing toward Felix, who was now dancing with Miss Hartnell. It's nothing, really. I just thought she might be here. She was so excited about the party. Miss Marple patted her hand. I'm sure she's fine. Perhaps she's just enjoying the festivities. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the implications of Felix's charm and Mrs. Price's unease. The widow had invested heavily, she knew, and the absence of returns was beginning to weigh on her as the party continued. Miss Marple slipped away, her steps slow but purposeful. She found Tommy Cole near the edge of the green, kicking at a tuft of grass. Good afternoon, Tommy, she said brightly. He looked up, startled. Oh, Miss Marple. Afternoon. Nice party, isn't it? Very nice, she said. You've been helping Mr. Langston, haven't you? At his cottage. Tommy nodded, a bit wary. Just some odd jobs. Fixing shelves, moving boxes. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. He must keep you busy. All those trips he takes must be a lot to manage. Tommy shrugged. He's got a lot of papers and things, always packing them up for his meetings. Says it's important business. Papers, you say? Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Financial documents. Perhaps, maybe, Tommy said, frowning. They're always in a locked case. He's particular about it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A locked case, frequent trips, a mysterious partner. The pieces were falling into place, but she needed more. You're a good lad, Tommy, she said, patting his arm. Keep your eyes open, won't you? He blinked at her, confused, but nodded. Yes, ma'am. As she returned to the marquee, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the vicar, Leonard Clement, who approached with a troubled expression. Miss Marple, might I have a word? Of course, Leonard. She followed him to a quieter corner of the green where the music was a faint hum. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone. It's about Mr. Langston. I've been trying to verify his credentials, but he's evasive. No office address, no references, just promises. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. You suspect he's not what he seems. Chapter 6. A cry for help. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest drawing room. She sat in her favorite armchair, a delicate teacup balanced on its saucer in her lap, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The rhythmic motion of the needles was soothing, but her mind was far from idle, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, were tingling with unease. She had spent the morning at the Women's Institute, where the chatter had been dominated by Felix's latest promises of wealth. His charm had worked its magic on many, but Miss Marple had noted the subtle cracks in his polished facade, his evasive answers, his too perfect smile, the way his eyes darted when pressed for details. She had seen such behavior before, in a traveling salesman years ago who had swindled her cousin's neighbor out of her savings. The memory had resurfaced sharply, and now, as she knitted, she turned it over in her mind, comparing it to Felix's actions. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting her knitting aside. The door creaked open, and Cherry, her young maid, poked her head in. "Mrs. Price is here, Miss Marple. She looks ever so upset. Shall I bring her in?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Yes, Cherry, please do. And perhaps put the kettle on. I suspect we'll need tea." Cherry nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with Mrs. Emily Price, the young widow who had recently lost her husband to a sudden illness. Emily was a slight woman, no older than 30, with delicate features and eyes that now brimmed with tears. Her hands twisted nervously at a handkerchief, and her usual composure was nowhere to be seen. "Oh, Miss Marple," Emily began, her voice trembling as she sank into the chair opposite. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I didn't know where else to turn." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression kind but alert. "My dear, you're not bothering me at all. Now, tell me what's wrong." Emily's lip quivered, and she dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief. "It's Mr. Langston," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I invested with him, you see, my inheritance, all of it. He promised such wonderful returns, and I thought it would secure my future. But now," she broke off, a sob escaping her. Miss Marple's heart ached for the young woman, but her mind was already racing. "Go on, Mrs. Price. What's happened?" Emily took a shaky breath. "I went to see him yesterday to ask about the progress of my investment. He was so kind at first, all smiles, but when I pressed him for details, he said the funds were tied up in some complicated deal in London. He said it might take months before I see any returns." "Months? Oh, Miss Marple, I can't afford to wait. That money was all I had." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her face remained gentle. "Tied up, you say? Did he offer any proof? Papers, perhaps, or a letter from his business associates?" "He just kept talking, saying it was all very technical and that I wouldn't understand. He promised everything would be fine, but I don't know, Miss Marple." There was something in his eyes, something. "You're not a fool, my dear," Miss Marple said firmly, reaching out to pat Emily's hand. "You trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. That's no failing on your part." Emily managed a weak smile, but her tears began anew. "What if I've lost it all? My husband worked so hard to leave me that money, and now I don't know what I'll do." Miss Marple poured tea from the pot Cherry had brought in, handing Emily a cup. "Drink this," she said softly. "It will steady you. And then we'll talk about what can be done." As Emily sipped the tea, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. Felix's vague assurances, his reluctance to provide documents. And now this delay in returns it, all pointed to a pattern she had seen before. She recalled a case from years ago, reported in the Daily Telegraph, about a charming con artist who had preyed on small towns, promising quick riches, and then vanishing with his victims' money. His tactic had been to stall, to offer excuses about delays, while he siphoned off funds. Felix's behavior fit the mold too neatly to be coincidence. Mrs. Price, Miss Marple said carefully, "When you spoke to Mr. Langston, did he mention anyone else? A partner, perhaps, or someone managing the investments in London?" Emily frowned, thinking, he said Mr. Carver was handling the London side of things, but he didn't elaborate. I didn't think to ask more. I was too worried about my money. Miss Marple nodded, filing the name away. "Mr. Carver," she murmured. "Interesting. Do you think there's hope, Miss Marple?" Emily asked, her voice small. "Can I get my money back?" Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words with care. "I can't promise anything, my dear, but I will look into this. Mr. Behavior raises questions, and I intend to find answers. For now, don't confront him further. Let's keep this between us." Emily nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I knew you'd know what to do." After Emily left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She considered the broader picture, Felix's arrival, his rapid ingratiation with the village, the way he targeted vulnerable people like Emily Price and the wealthy Miss Hartnell, his lavish garden party, where he had been so attentive to those with money to spare, had been a masterstroke in building trust. But trust, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile thing, easily exploited by those with no scruples. She rose and crossed to her writing desk, pulling out a small notebook where she kept her observations. Flipping to a fresh page, she jotted down Felix Langston evasive about past, vague about investments, mentions Mr. Carver, pattern of delays, no documents, possible scam, similar to 1928 case in Dorset. She paused, tapping her pencil against the page. The Dorset case had involved two men, a charming frontman who won over the victims, and a shadowy partner who handled the money. If Felix was working with this Mr. Carver, the setup might be the same. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, and Miss Marple closed her notebook. She would need more information before acting, but Emily's distress had solidified her resolve. She couldn't let Felix prey on St. Mary Mead unchecked. The village was her home, its people her friends, and she felt a quiet duty to protect them. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for her daily walk, her straw hat tilted against the sun. Her destination was the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the stamps. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, was a font of information, and Miss Marple intended to steer the conversation toward Felix. The post office was bustling, as it often was on a Thursday morning. Mrs. Weatherby stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she handed out parcels and letters. Miss Marple waited her turn, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, who was mailing a letter to her daughter in London. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said brightly. "Have you heard the latest about Mr. Langston? He's planning another investment meeting next week." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Oh, you're always so sensible, Jane. But he's such a charming man, don't you think? I put in a bit myself, you know." Arthur's skeptical, "but I think it's worth a try." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver, but her heart sank. Mrs. Bantry with her kind heart and trusting nature, was exactly the sort of person Felix would target. "Do be careful, Dolly," she said gently. "It's wise to ask for details before partying with money." Double quotes. Mrs. Bantry waved a hand. "Oh, I'm sure it's fine. He showed us a prospectus, you know. Very official looking." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note to ask about this prospectus. When her turn at the counter came, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Weatherby, have you had any dealings with Mr. Langston lately? I hear he's been quite busy." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the prospect of gossip. "Oh, indeed, Miss Marple, he's in here nearly every day, sending telegrams to London. Always in a hurry, that one. Paid for a whole stack of them with a crisp £10 note last week. I said to my Tom, who carries that kind of money in St. Mary Mead." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Did he say who the telegrams were for?" "Or not a word," Mrs. Weatherby replied, leaning closer. "But I caught a glimpse of one named Carver, I think it was. Sounded like a business associate." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "How interesting. Well, thank you, Mrs. Weatherby. I'll take a book of stamps, please." As she left the post office, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz. The mention of Carver again confirmed her suspicions of a partnership. She recalled a trick used by the Dorset swindler. The front man would collect money in the provinces, while his accomplice in the city laundered it through fake companies. If Felix and Carver were following a similar playbook, the telegrams suggested they were coordinating their efforts. Her walk took her past the vicarage, where she spotted Leonard Clement tending his roses. The vicar had been one of the few to express doubts about Felix, and Miss Marple decided to probe further. She approached, her parasol shielding her from the sun. Chapter 7. The False Trail. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside her, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. To an outsider, she might have appeared the picture of serene domesticity, but her mind was far from idle. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with talk of Felix Langston, the charming newcomer whose promises of wealth had ensnared the hopes of many. Miss Marple, however, saw through the polished veneer, her suspicions sharpened by a lifetime of observing human nature. The latest development, a rumor that painted Mr. Gibbs, a local farmer, as a jealous saboteur, had only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth. The rumor had spread like wildfire through the village, as rumors often did in St. Mary Mead. It began, as far as Miss Marple could trace, at the village shop, where Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, had overheard Felix lamenting that his business ventures were being undermined by a spiteful local. By the time the story reached the tea rooms and the churchyard, it had grown into a full-blown accusation. Mr. Gibbs, a gruff but honest farmer known for his prize-winning pigs, was supposedly envious of Felix's success and spreading lies to discredit him. The villagers, ever eager for a bit of drama, had taken sides. Some, like Mrs. Bantry, defended Felix, charmed by his generosity at the garden party. Others, like the sharp-tongued Miss Hartnell, were less convinced, though even she admitted Felix's manners were impeccable. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by charm or gossip. She had known Mr. Gibbs for years. His temper was short, true, but his heart was as solid as the earth he tilled. The idea that he would stoop to sabotage struck her as absurd, like casting a sheepdog as a wolf. Felix's accusation, she suspected, was a calculated move, a distraction to shift attention from his own questionable dealings. She had seen such tactics before, in the case of a traveling salesman who had swindled her cousin's neighbor years ago. That man, too, had pointed fingers at others to cover his tracks. The parallel was striking, and Miss Marple resolved to pay Mr. Gibbs a visit to hear his side of the story. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. The clock on the mantel showed 10:30 early enough for a walk to Gibbs' farm without arousing suspicion, which she filled with a jar of her homemade gooseberry jam as a pretext for the visit. In St. Mary Mead, one did not simply drop by. One arrived with a purpose, however small. The path to Gibbs' farm wound past the vicarage and through a stretch of fields dotted with grazing cows. The air was warm, scented with clover and the faint tang of manure, a reminder of the village's rural heart. Miss Marple walked at a leisurely pace, nodding to passers-by, a milkmaid balancing pails, a boy herding geese. She was careful to keep her expression pleasant, her eyes bright with the mild curiosity expected of an elderly spinster. No one would guess that her mind was turning over every detail of Felix's behavior, from his vague answers about his past to the crisp banknotes he'd used at the shop. Gibbs' farm came into view, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, the barn roof gleaming with fresh paint. Mr. Gibbs was in the yard, mending a fence, his sleeves rolled up and his face red from exertion. He straightened as Miss Marple approached, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Good morning, Mr. Gibbs," she called, her voice light but clear. "I've brought you some of my gooseberry jam. I thought it might go nicely with your wife's scones." Mr. Gibbs grunted, a sound that might have been gratitude or suspicion. He was a man of few words, his broad shoulders and calloused hands speaking more of his character than any speech. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, taking the jar with a nod. "Kind of you. What brings you out this way?" Miss Marple smiled, setting her basket down on a nearby stump. "Oh, just a fancy for a walk. And, well, I couldn't help overhearing the talk in the village. It seems there's been some misunderstanding about you and Mr. Langston." Gibbs's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Misunderstanding, is it? That's a polite way of putting it. The man's been slandering me, saying I'm out to ruin his fancy schemes. I don't trust him, Miss Marple, and I'll say it plain. He's no good." She tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "Dear me, that's a strong statement. Has he done something to offend you personally?" Gibbs leaned on his hammer, his eyes narrowing. "Came to me last month. He did, all smiles and city talk. Wanted to buy my Southfield prime land. Mind you, best for grazing at half its worth. Said he needed it for some big project, but wouldn't say what. I told him no, and he didn't like that one bit. Next thing I know, I'm the villain in his story, poisoning the village against him." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if itching to pick up her knitting needles. This was precisely the sort of detail she'd hoped to uncover. A land deal, even a failed one, suggested Felix had motives beyond his so-called investments. "How very curious," she said softly. "Did he mention anything specific about this project?" "Not a word," Gibbs replied, spitting into the dirt. "Just kept saying it'd make me rich if I sold." I've seen his kind before, smooth talkers, who think a farmer's daft enough to hand over his livelihood. I told him to take his offer and shove it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The south field was a valuable parcel, close to the main road and bordered by a stream, ideal for development, if one had the capital and the intent. But Felix, by all accounts, was a transient, a man who moved from place to place. Why would he want land unless it was part of a larger scheme, perhaps to sell it at a profit? She filed the thought away, her face betraying nothing but polite interest. "I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding," she said, her tone soothing. "You know how gossip can twist things. I'll have a word with Mrs. Bantry's quite taken with Mr. Langston, but she's sensible enough to listen." Gibbs snorted. Sensible. She's half in love with the man's smile. "But you're right, Miss Marple. You've got a way of sorting things out. If anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's you." She smiled modestly, picking up her basket. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to keep the peace. Thank you for the chat, Mr. Gibbs. Do give my regards to your wife." As she walked back to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections. Felix's attempt to buy Gibbs's land was a piece of the puzzle, but it didn't yet fit with the investment scheme. Was he planning to use the land as bait for more investors, promising a grand development that would never materialize? Or was it a fallback, a way to secure an asset before he vanished with the villagers' money? She recalled a case in the newspapers, a swindler who had bought up cheap land in a small town, then sold shares in a non-existent factory to be built there. The similarities were striking, but she needed more evidence. Back in St. Mary Mead, the village was bustling with its usual rhythm. The baker's van trundled down the lane, and children played near the duck pond, their laughter mingling with the clatter of teacups from the tea shop. Miss Marple paused at the post office, where Mrs. Weatherby was sorting letters with her usual air of importance. "Good day, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "I was just wondering if you'd seen Mr. Langston today. He's been so busy with his plans, hasn't he?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes lit up, eager for a chance to share the latest tidbits. "Oh, indeed, Miss Marple. He was in this morning, posting a parcel to London. Quite a heavy one, too. I had to charge him extra. Said it was business papers, but he was in a rush, didn't want to chat." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "To London, you say? How interesting. Did he mention an address?" "No, but I saw the label, some office in the city, near Cheapside. I couldn't quite make out the name. He's always sending things off, you know. Says it's for his investors, but I do wonder." "You're very observant, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said, her tone warm with approval. "It's a comfort to know our post office is in such capable hands." "Flattered," Mrs. Weatherby puffed up slightly. "Well, I do my best to keep things running smoothly. If you ask me, though, there's something odd about all these parcels. And that business with Mr. Gibbs, shocking, isn't it?" "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, her mind already elsewhere. A parcel to London, possibly to an accomplice. Cheapside was a busy area, full of offices and warehouses, perfect for hiding illicit transactions. She thanked Mrs. Weatherby and stepped outside, her eyes scanning the village green. Felix was nowhere in sight, but she knew he'd be at the Blue Boar later, where he often held court with the villagers, spinning tales of wealth and opportunity. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the tea shop, nibbling a scone and listening. To the chatter around her, Mrs. Bantry was there, holding forth about Felix's latest proposal, a new investment round that promised even higher returns. "He says it's a once-in-a-lifetime chance," she enthused, her cheeks flushed. "Something about a shipping venture. I'm thinking of putting in another £100. Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. A shipping venture? How intriguing. Did he mention any details, ports, cargo, that sort of thing? Chapter 8. Sir Henry's visit. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a warmth that belied the undercurrent of unease rippling through its cobblestone streets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The familiar motion soothed her, but her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. Her thoughts were occupied by Felix Langston, the charming newcomer whose polished manners and promises of wealth had ensnared the village's trust. To Miss Marple, his charm was a veneer, thin and brittle, concealing something far less savory. She had seen his kind before, men who spoke with honeyed words but left ruin in their wake. The ticking of the mantel clock was interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, smoothing her skirt as she rose. Her maid, Cherry, bustled in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, it's Sir Henry Clithering. He's just arrived and says he'd like to see you straight away," Cherry announced, her eyes bright with the thrill of a distinguished visitor. "Show him in, Cherry, and please bring the tea tray. The Darjeeling, I think, and those lemon biscuits he's fond of," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but her eyes sharpening with interest. Sir Henry's arrival was timely, almost providentially so. Moments later, Sir Henry Clithering strode into the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, keen as ever, softened with warmth as they met Miss Marple's, a retired Scotland Yard commissioner. Sir Henry was no stranger to St. Mary Mead, having visited on several occasions to escape the bustle of London. He and Miss Marple shared a mutual respect, forged through years of unraveling mysteries together, each appreciating the other's knack for seeing what others missed. "Jane, my dear, it's been too long," Sir Henry said, taking her hand with a gentlemanly bow. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Nonsense, Henry," Miss Marple replied, gesturing to the armchair opposite her. "You're always welcome here. I suspect, though, that this isn't entirely a social call." Sir Henry chuckled, settling into the chair as Cherry arrived with the tea tray. The aroma of Darjeeling filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from the vase on the sideboard. "You're as perceptive as ever," he said, accepting a cup. "I've heard whispers about a certain Mr. Langston causing a stir in your quiet village. Thought I'd come see what's afoot and, of course, to enjoy your company." Miss Marple poured her own tea, her movements deliberate as she considered her response. "Felix Langston," she said, her tone measured. "A charming man, by all accounts generous, too, with his donations to the church roof fund and his promises of prosperous investments. The village is quite taken with him." "But not you," Sir Henry observed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sipped his tea. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I find his charm a little too practiced, Henry, like a play rehearsed one too many times. He reminds me of a young man I knew years ago in St. Mary. Met a traveling salesman who sold dreams of riches and left with the contents of several widows' savings. Felix Langston is cut from similar cloth, I suspect. Sir Henry leaned back, his fingers steepled a grifter. Then, I've seen my share of them in London. Smooth talkers, every one, with a knack for exploiting trust. Have you anything concrete, Jane? Or is this one of your famous hunches? Not entirely a hunch, Miss Marple replied, setting her cup down. There's a pattern emerging. Felix offers these so-called investment opportunities, but when pressed for details, he's evasive. Mrs. Emily Price, a young widow, invested her entire inheritance with him. And now she's heard nothing but excuses about her funds being tied up. Others, like Mrs. Bantry, have parted with significant sums as well. Then there's the matter of his frequent trips out of the village and the large banknotes he uses for small purchases. Shopkeeper mentioned it to me just yesterday. Sir Henry frowned, his mind already sifting through possibilities. Large banknotes in a village like this, that's unusual. And the trips could be meeting an accomplice. Have you spoken to the local constable about this? Miss Marple shook her head. Constable Hurst is a good man, but he's more suited to settling disputes over stolen chickens than unraveling financial schemes. Besides, Felix is clever. He's left no obvious trail at least, not yet. I was rather hoping you might lend your expertise, Henry. Sir Henry's eyes gleamed with interest. You know, I can't resist a puzzle, especially when it's one you've sniffed out. Tell me everything you know about this Langston fellow, and I'll see what I can dig up through my old contacts at the Yard. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low and precise as she recounted the details. Felix's arrival in St. Mary Mead 6 weeks prior, his claim of being a wealthy investor seeking a quiet retreat, his generous donations that had won the vicar's initial trust, and the exclusive investment opportunities he dangled before the villagers. She described his polished manners, his vague answers about his past, and the garden party where he'd let slip a mention of a business partner in London. She also shared her recent conversation with Mr. Gibbs, the farmer Felix had tried to swindle into selling his land at a pittance, and the rumor Felix had spread to discredit him. Gibbs is no fool, Miss Marple said. He saw through Felix's offer, but the village has turned against him, thanks to Felix's whispers. It's a clever tactic to avert suspicion by creating a scapegoat. I've seen it before, you know, in a case years ago in Much Benham. Charlatan convinced the villagers that the local butcher was cheating them, all to cover his own thefts. Sir Henry nodded, his expression grim. Sounds like a classic con. These types often work in pairs, one to charm the marks, the other to handle the dirty work. This business partner in London could be key. Did Langston give any details about him? None, Miss Marple said. He changed the subject as soon as the words slipped out. But I've been watching him, Henry. He's careful, but not careful enough. There's a ledger in his cottage. I haven't seen it myself, but Mrs. Weatherby, who cleans for him, mentioned he's very particular about a locked drawer in his desk. I suspect it holds something incriminating. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. You're not planning to break in, I hope, Jane? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with mischief. Goodness, no. I'm far too old for such antics. But I might arrange for someone to have a look discreetly, of course. Cherry, my maid, is rather resourceful, and she's friendly with the girl who helps Mrs. Weatherby. A word in the right ear, and we might learn more." Sir Henry laughed, shaking his head. "You're incorrigible, Jane. Very well, I'll make some inquiries. I still have friends at the Yard who can check for known swindlers matching Langston's description. If he's pulled this sort of thing before, there'll be a record. In the meantime, keep your eyes open. If he's planning to bolt, he'll likely make a move soon, especially if he suspects anyone's onto him." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Miss Marple rose and peered through the lace curtains. A small crowd had gathered near the village green, their voices raised in excitement. She recognized Mrs. Bantry's distinctive hat bobbing among them, and at the center stood Felix Langston, gesticulating animatedly. "Speak of the devil," Sir Henry murmured, joining her at the window. "What's he up to now?" "He's announcing something," Miss Marple said, her brow furrowing. "He's been dropping hints about a new investment. Opportunities, something urgent and once in a lifetime. I heard him mention it at the post office yesterday. He's likely trying to reel in a few more before he disappears." Sir Henry's jaw tightened. If he's pushing a new scheme, he's either getting greedy or desperate. Either way, it's a sign he's not planning to stay long. Will need to act quickly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing. "I'll keep watch, Henry. If he's planning to fleece the village and vanish, he'll need to move the money first. That's when he'll be most vulnerable. We just need to catch him in the act." Sir Henry finished his tea and stood, adjusting his jacket. "I'll head to London tomorrow and see what the Yard has on him. I'll also check for any known associates, your mysterious business partner, perhaps. If Langston's working a con, he won't be doing it alone. Meanwhile, Jane, be careful. These types can turn nasty when cornered." "I'm always careful, Henry," Miss Marple said, with a serene smile, "but I do appreciate the concern." As Sir Henry took his leave, promising to return in a few days with any findings, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The needles resumed their steady rhythm, but her thoughts were elsewhere, weaving a plan as intricate as the patterns in her shawl. Felix Langston was clever, but he was not infallible. She had seen his kind before, and she knew their weaknesses: overconfidence, greed, and the fatal mistake of underestimating an old lady with a knack for noticing details. The next morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed with the news of Felix's latest venture. At the village shop, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price and Miss Hartnell discussing the urgent investment opportunity Felix had unveiled at the Green. It was a mining venture, he'd claimed, backed by a reputable firm in London. The returns were guaranteed, he said, but only for those who acted quickly. Miss Hart, whose substantial savings made her a prime target, was visibly tempted, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of profit. Chapter 9. The Missing Ledger. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage. The village was stirring with its usual rhythm. Milk bottles clinked at doorsteps. The baker's van rumbled down the lane, and the faint chime of the church bell signaled the hour. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, Miss Marple's mind was anything but idle. Her suspicions about Felix Langston had deepened, and the pieces of his possible deception were beginning to form a pattern, much like the intricate stitches of the scarf she was knitting. She sat in her armchair, her fingers deftly working the needles, but her thoughts were fixed on the ledger, the one she had heard whispers of, the one that might hold the key to unraveling Felix's schemes. The ledger had come to her attention through Mrs. Price, the young widow who had invested her inheritance with Felix. During their tearful conversation the previous day, Mrs. Price had mentioned, almost in passing, that Felix had been seen scribbling in a small, leather-bound book. During one of his meetings, he was so particular about it, Mrs. Price had said, her voice trembling. He tucked it away the moment I asked about it, as if it were some great secret. Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically, but her mind had seized upon the detail. A ledger, she thought, was precisely the sort of thing a man like Felix would keep a record of his dealings, legitimate or otherwise. If she could only get a glimpse of it, she might find the evidence she needed to confirm her suspicions. The challenge, of course, was access. Felix had taken a small cottage on the edge of the village, a quaint but secluded place that had once belonged to old Mrs. Harrow. It was a perfect spot for a man who valued privacy, with its high hedges and a garden gate that creaked loudly, enough to announce any visitor. Felix was too cautious, too smooth, but the village was abuzz with preparations for the annual flower show, an event that drew every resident to the church hall for a day of roses, dahlias, and friendly competition. Felix, ever eager to maintain his image as a generous benefactor, had promised to attend and even contribute a prize for the best arrangement. It was the perfect opportunity, Miss Marple realized, for a discreet investigation. She set her knitting aside and rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt. Her plan would require an ally, someone young and nimble, someone who could move unnoticed while the village was distracted. Her thoughts turned immediately to Cherry Baker, her maid, a bright, young woman with a sharp mind and a knack for noticing details. Cherry had come to St. Mary Mead from the nearby town of Much Benham, and though she was still considered an outsider by some, Miss Marple had grown fond of her quick wit and resourcefulness. If anyone could help with a task as delicate as this, it was Cherry. Miss Marple found Cherry in the kitchen, polishing the silver teapot with a vigor that suggested she was working off some private frustration. "Cherry, my dear," Miss Marple began, her tone as gentle as ever, "I wonder if I might ask for your help with a small matter." Cherry looked up, her dark eyes curious. "Of course, Miss Marple, what's it about?" Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words carefully, and Cherry, she knew, had a strong sense of right and wrong. "It's about Mr. Langston," she said, lowering her voice. "I'm afraid he may not be entirely honest with the people of this village. There's a ledger in his audiobook he keeps his business dealings in. I believe it might tell us whether he's been truthful about his investments." Cherry's brow furrowed. "You think he's swindling folks, don't you? I've heard Mrs. Price crying her eyes out over her money. And Mr. Gibbs, the farmer, he's been grumbling about Mr. Langston trying to buy his land for next to nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "Exactly, Cherry. But we must be careful. Mr. Langston is clever, and he won't take kindly to anyone poking into his affairs. The flower show tomorrow will keep him occupied at the church hall. If we could just have a quick look inside his cottage, we might find something useful." Cherry's eyes widened, but a spark of excitement flickered in them. "You mean sneak in? Oh, Miss Marple, that's bold, but I'm game if you are. What do you need me to do?" Miss Marple smiled, pleased by Cherry's enthusiasm. "Nothing too dangerous, my dear. You, meanwhile, could slip into his cottage just for a moment. Mind you see if you can locate that ledger. It's likely in his study, perhaps in a desk or a locked drawer. Don't touch anything else, and don't stay longer than necessary. Cherry nodded, her jaw set with determination. I can do that. I've got a light step, and I know how to be quiet. But what if I get caught? You won't, Miss Marple said firmly. I'll make sure Mr. Langston is distracted, and if anyone else is about, you're simply delivering a basket of scones from me as a neighborly gesture. No one will suspect a thing. The plan was set, and as the day of the flower show dawned, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. She had always believed that the key to solving any puzzle lay in understanding human nature, and Felix Langston, for all his charm, was no exception. He was a man who thrived on trust, who relied on the goodwill of others to mask his intentions. But Miss Marple had seen his kind before, men who thought themselves cleverer than everyone else, only to be undone by their own overconfidence. The flower show was a splendid affair, with the church hall transformed into a riot of color and fragrance. Tables groaned under the weight of roses, chrysanthemums, and peonies, each arrangement vying for the judges' approval. The villagers milled about, exchanging gossip and admiring the displays, while children darted between the tables, sneaking biscuits from the refreshment stand. Felix was in his element, shaking hands and offering compliments, his tailored suit and polished shoes setting him apart from the more modestly dressed villagers. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, blended into the crowd, her sharp eyes never leaving Felix. She stationed herself near the tea urn, where she could observe the entire room. Mrs. Bantry, her friend and a fellow victim of Felix's schemes, was fussing over her prize-winning dahlias, her face flushed with pride. Miss Hartnell, the wealthy spinster Felix had been courting, was hovering near him, her laughter a little too loud as he complimented her roses. Miss Marple noted the way Felix's gaze lingered on Miss Hartnell's diamond brooch, a family heirloom worth a small fortune. He's marking his next target, she thought, her lips tightening to keep Felix occupied. Miss Marple enlisted the help of the vicar, Leonard Clement, who was only too happy to assist after his own doubts about Felix. Leonard, dear, she said, drawing him aside, I wonder if you might engage Mr. Langston in a discussion about the Church Restoration Fund. He's been so generous with his donations, and I'm sure he'd love to hear your plans in detail. The vicar, a kind but slightly absent-minded man, nodded eagerly. Of course, Miss Marple, I've been meaning to thank him properly. Perhaps he'd consider sponsoring the new stained glass window. Miss Marple smiled. I'm sure he'd be delighted to discuss it with you, at length. As the vicar approached Felix, Miss Marple slipped out of the hall and made her way to the high street, where she could signal Cherry. The girl was waiting near the post office, a basket of scones in hand as their cover story. He's busy with the vicar, Miss Marple whispered. Now's your chance. Be quick and be careful. Cherry gave a brisk nod and set off toward Felix's cottage, her steps light but purposeful. Miss Marple returned to the hall, her heart beating a little faster. She trusted Cherry's competence, but there was always a risk. If Felix suspected anything, he might bolt, and the village would lose any chance of recovering their money. Inside the cottage, Cherry moved with the stealth of a cat. The front door was unlocked, common in St. Mary Mead, where neighbors trusted one another, and she slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The interior was tidy but impersonal, with few personal belongings beyond a stack of business cards and a framed photograph of a city skyline. Cherry made her way to the small study at the back, her eyes darting from the desk to a bookshelf lined with financial journals. The desk was her best bet. She tried the drawers, but the top one was locked. Her heart sank, but she remembered Miss Marple's advice. Look for the obvious first, Cherry. People like him often hide things in plain sight, thinking no one will dare look. On a hunch, she lifted a decorative inkstand on the desk and found a small key taped to its underside. Her fingers trembled as she fitted the key into the lock, and the drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside was the ledger, slim, leather-bound book with FL embossed on the cover. Cherry opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. The entries were written in a neat hand, but the figures were cryptic, marked with initials and abbreviations rather than names. There were some large, some listed alongside dates, some as recent as the past week. One entry caught her eye. EP £2,000 transferred to C. Could EP be Emily Price? And who was C? Chapter 10. The accomplice revealed. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silvery glow across the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens. It was nearing midnight, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, stirred by a gentle autumn breeze. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on the shadowy lane below. She had positioned herself here deliberately, as she had done for the past 3 nights, ever since she'd overheard a snippet of conversation at the village shop about a late visitor seen near Mr. Felix Langston's rented cottage. Miss Marple's suspicions about Felix had deepened with each passing day. The man's charm, his polished manners, and his 2 perfect stories of wealth and success had begun to unravel in her mind like a poorly knitted scarf. She had seen his type before decades ago in her youth, when a silver-tongued salesman had swindled her uncle's parish out of funds meant for a new church roof. Felix's vague answers about his past, his frequent absences from the village, and the crisp banknotes he flashed so casually all pointed to one conclusion: he was a grifter, and a clever one at that. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, often tripped over its own arrogance. She sensed she was on the cusp of uncovering the key to Felix's scheme. Her vigil began at 10 o'clock. After she'd bid good night to her maid, Cherry, and extinguished the parlor lamps to maintain the appearance of a sleeping household. She had chosen her bedroom window because it offered a clear view of the lane leading to Felix's cottage. The cottage's garden gate was just visible through a gap in the hedgerow, and Miss Marple's keen eyes, undimmed by age, were trained on it. Grifters of his caliber often had accomplices, someone to handle the dirty work or spirit away the spoils, and tonight she intended to catch a glimpse of that accomplice. The village clock struck 11:30. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and leaned closer to the window, her breath barely misting the glass. She had learned patience over the years, a virtue honed by countless hours of observing human nature. People revealed themselves in the small things: a glance, a hesitation, a slip of the tongue. Answers about his business partner had all raised red flags. And then there was the matter of Mrs. Emily Price, the young widow who had tearfully confessed to Miss Marple that her investment with Felix had yielded nothing but excuses. The poor woman's distress had only strengthened Miss Marple's resolve. As the minutes ticked by, who had fleeced a string of small towns with promises of railway investments? Carver had worked with a partner, a man who posed as a legitimate businessman while Carver handled the forged documents and laundered funds. The parallels to Felix's behavior were striking, and Miss Marple had begun to wonder if Carver, or someone like him, was involved. She had already asked her friend, Sir Henry Clithering, the former Scotland Yard commissioner, to check police records for similar scams. Sir Henry's reply was due any day, but Miss Marple was not one to wait idly. She preferred to gather her own evidence, and tonight her instincts told her she was close. A faint creak broke the silence, the sound of a gate swinging on its hinges. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm, her hands steady. She peered through the window, her eyes narrowing as a figure emerged from the shadows near Felix's cottage. The man was tall, with a lanky frame and a slight stoop, as if accustomed to ducking attention. He wore a dark overcoat and a flat cap pulled low over his brow, but the moonlight caught the glint of spectacles and the sharp angle of his jaw. He moved with purpose, glancing over his shoulder before slipping through the garden gate. Miss Marple's mind raced. It reminded her of a man she'd encountered briefly during a trip to London. The man had been charming, but his eyes had darted too quickly, his gestures too practiced. Could this be the same person? Or was it simply her memory playing tricks, drawing parallels where none existed? She pushed the thought aside and focused on the present. The man was inside Felix's garden now, and she needed to see what he did next. The cottage door opened, spilling a sliver of lamplight onto the path. Felix appeared, his silhouette unmistakable, broad shoulders, neatly combed hair, and the confident posture of a man who believed himself untouchable. He greeted the stranger with a quick handshake, then ushered him inside. The door closed, and the lane fell silent again. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles clicking softly as she processed what she'd seen. The stranger's arrival confirmed her suspicion. Felix had a partner, but who was this man, and what was their connection? She considered her options. Confronting Felix directly was out of the question. He was too slippery, too quick with excuses. She needed hard evidence, something to tie Felix to a crime, or at least to expose his deceit to the village. She needed to know more about this stranger. And she needed to act before Felix's next investment opportunity drained more villagers' savings. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her mind sharp despite the late hour of her vigil. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, her appearance as unassuming as ever, and made her way to the village post office. Seeming to pry over a cup of tea, she steered the conversation toward Felix's cottage, mentioning she'd seen a light on late the previous night. "Oh, that'd be Mr. Langston's visitor," Mrs. Blades said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of sharing news. "A Mr. Carver, I heard, came in on the late train, so they say. Not much to look at, but he had a fancy suitcase, all leather and brass. Carver, you say?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her pulse quickened. The name matched the swindler from the old case. "Not sure," Mrs. Blades admitted. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Blades and left her, mind buzzing. Carver. The name was no coincidence. She recalled the details of the railway scam. Reginald Carver had been arrested, but released on a technicality his partner never caught. Could Felix be that partner, or had Carver found a new accomplice? Either way, the late-night meeting suggested they were planning something, perhaps the final stage of their scheme, before they vanished with the villagers' money back at her cottage. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and penned a quick note to Sir Henry, asking him to prioritize his inquiries about Reginald Carver. She also jotted down her observations from the night before, noting the stranger's appearance and mannerisms. Her memory for faces was remarkable, and she was certain she'd seen Carver's stoop and spectacles before. If she was right, Felix and Carver were working together to funnel the village's investments into their own pockets. Flushed Miss Marple, "You won't believe it. Mr. Langston's just announced he's holding another meeting tomorrow. Says it's the last chance to invest before his big deal goes through. Half the village is talking about it." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "Is that so?" she murmured. Her mind was already at work, piecing together a plan. Felix's urgency suggested he was preparing to flee, and Carver's visit was likely to finalize their escape. She couldn't let them slip away, not with Mrs. Price's inheritance, Mrs. Bantry's savings, and the trust of St. Mary Mead at stake. But she needed to be cleverer than Felix, cleverer than Carver. She needed a trap, one that would expose their deceit without endangering the villagers further. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the vicarage, where she found Leonard Clement pruning his roses. The vicar had been uneasy about Felix from the start, and she trusted his discretion. "Leonard," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I believe Mr. Langston is not what he seems. I've seen evidence of a partner, a man named Carver. I need your help to spread a little rumor." The vicar's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "What sort of rumor, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Nothing untrue, of course. Just a hint that I've come into a rather large sum of money in inheritance. Perhaps sand, that I'm considering investing it with Mr. Langston. Let's see if he takes the bait." Leonard hesitated, then chuckled. "You're a sly one, Miss Marple. I'll see that the word gets out." By evening, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Miss Marple knew the village's gossip network was unmatched in speed and efficiency. By morning, Felix would surely hear of her windfall. She returned to her cottage and resumed her knitting, her mind as busy as her needles. If Felix was as greedy as she suspected, he wouldn't resist the chance to charm a wealthy old spinster out of her money. And when he came to her, she would be ready. The next day, as expected, Felix called at her cottage, his smile as polished as ever. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "I heard you might be interested in my latest venture. It's a rare opportunity, quite exclusive." Miss Marple invited him in, her demeanor meek and curious. "Oh, Mr. Langston, I'm just a simple woman, but I've come into a little money, you see. I'd love to hear more." As Felix launched into his pitch, filled with vague promises of guaranteed returns and secure bonds, Miss Marple listened attentively, her eyes bright with feigned interest. But behind her gentle smile, she was cataloguing every word, every gesture, every flicker of his expression. He was good, very good, but not good enough to fool her. She asked pointed questions, noting how he deflected specifics with charm and flattery. By the time he left, promising to return with detailed terms, Miss Marple was certain Felix and Carver were planning to flee soon, and her investment was their final prize. That night, she sat by her window again, watching the lane. The moon was obscured by clouds, but she didn't need light to know what was coming. Felix's confidence was his weakness, and Carver's involvement was the thread that would unravel their scheme. She would need Sir Henry's help to set the trap, but the idea was already forming a public meeting, a staged investment, and a few well-placed questions to expose Felix's lies. The villagers deserved to know the truth, and she would ensure they did. As she closed her curtains and prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Human nature, she thought, was predictable in its flaws. Greed, arrogance, and deceit always left traces like crumbs on a tablecloth. And she, Jane Marple, was very good at sweeping up crumbs.